Greetings, and once again, welcome to Aspects of Aliyah in the midst of a mini deluge in the UK. So we're going to pick up where we left off. So firstly, after our discussion of the deluge and the landing, shall we say, we need to draw a conclusion. So, firstly, it is important to remember that the narrative was shaped for an ancient people who held a completely different perspective to modern age, us today if you want, on any number of matters. It is quite clear they had no conception whatsoever of the shape of the earth or even what the universe was. What is it? They had all kinds of ideas what was up in the sky. Now, Christian fundamentalists and others who insist on a global flood are imposing that term upon a text, because the original audience got no idea whatsoever that the world was a globe. So, with no disrespect to fundamentalists, it doesn't work. In a similar manner, any geophysical, speculative questions concerning maritime construction, geological effects, the impossibility of every living species being on board the ark, or post-flood animal migrations or similar questions are completely misunderstanding the point of the story. Mini synopsis. This is an etymological narrative. Fundamentalism and literalism does not work within these kind of things because, firstly, the impossibilities contained within it. Hebrews 11 verse 6 says this: without faith, it's impossible to please God. He doesn't say that blind faith, and insisting on a text, there's a third translation into a foreign language explains everything just as it's written down. I've no problem with people who want to think like this. All I want to say is, when you take these kind of things, what happens is that the three-stranded cord of God, land and people is not only lost, it's obliterated. So, in the narrative, the final recension, I said it, but the final recension is the way we got it in the Bible today. Okay. The author has recast overall traditions and stories, songs, all these kind of things, to teach about the consequences of sin and the merciful love of God for his creation. I want to say this again. I'm fairly sure that some people who have not stopped watching this because they think I'm a little bit too academic in my presentations. I want to tell you that the more I read these things, the more my faith increases. Because in God's grace and mercy, in a pre-literate society, in a pre-scientific society, he left us these beautiful records of how the people understood him, the Jewish people, and the land of Israel. And we need to view these things in the way that God in His mercy transmitted these things to people without the benefits of today. No internet, no encyclopedias, no books, very little food and water on occasion. But that's something that we lost, and that is the oral transmission. And I've said to you before, we lose the dynamic of the New Testament, particularly the letters, because these things, all of them, were designed to be read aloud. Not only read aloud, but also enacted dramatically. I want you to try and think about the story of the Deluge being recited and enacted dramatically. And I always used to say to my students when I was in academia as a lecturer, tutor, and so on, do not read the scriptures silently. Read them out loud. And if you have got the privilege of being able to read them in the Greek and Hebrew, read them out loud. And there's a whole different dynamic comes forth. It's a wonderful thing to do. When Paul said to Timothy, Timothy, my son, do not neglect the public reading of scriptures, that's exactly what we're talking about. Read scripts out loud, but also walk around reading them. I had the privilege of helping in Operation Solomon that brought these 14,000 plus beautiful Ethiopian Jewish people back to Eretz Israel. But previous to that, I'd also worked there with the Jewish people, but also with the Orthodox Ethiopians. And after, it's on one of our other broadcasts, but I just want to put this into this context. There's a religious order that is informal. It's called Dawit, which is Amharic for David. And in the walls of the cities, they have these sort of little caves, or cells, or whatever you want to call them. And these people eschew a life of poverty and live in there. And the only thing they've got is the Book of Psalms and a cross. Some are made of metal, some are made of brass, some are made of bronze, some made of wood, and even some are even made of gold. And now we walk around the streets, and a lot of them have learnt the whole thing by rote, and they walk around reciting the whole Book of Psalms. And when somebody sees them, they bend down before a member of Dawit, and they put this very ornamentalized cross on the head, and they speak out a blessing to them, which is very often the Aaronic blessing, because, of course, the Ethiopians practiced Judaism for over 1,300 years. And the people receive the blessing, give Dawit food, wine, tetch, it's like a very high standard beer, or even the local alcoholic honey hooch. But Dawit are very highly esteemed, and even though the idea of Dawit comes from Judaism to a certain degree, one of their causations is the idea of reading God's word in public. Now, my late departed friend Derek Prince used to say that if you're anywhere where Islam is resident and the curse has been spoken out from the minarets, walk around quoting the scriptures, and that will cancel it off. Keep the air clear. Bit of a diversion, I know. But what I'm trying to say is if we look at this story about the funny thing, it needs to be remembered. It needs to be spoken out. It needs to be shared, not simply sat and read. I do believe that God wants us to be dynamic and active, and the scriptures are weapons, aren't they? Yeah. So, if you look at the story of Noah and his generations, if you look at God's mercy after this gross sin that took place on the earth, he reserved for himself a remnant in Noah and his family. And we've got a recreation. My beloved, read these scriptures and read them out loud. Man, be part of your life and thank God for his love and his mercy in this dreadful age that we live in. It's not my job to speak to you about morals and ethics. It's not my job to speak to you about how people should behave. My call, it's not a job. My call is to try and encourage you to rejoice in God's word and the way it's been received, particularly by the Jewish people, and our responsibility when we hear this word, which is this three-stranded cord, God, land, people. Now, how can we possibly fulfill our task if we don't understand it? So, anyway, divertissement, as they say in France. Now, to me, there are 3 or possibly 4 big issues within the Deluge narrative. The first one is that sin, rebellion, brings consequences. The second thing is that God is merciful. And the third thing is, if God has been merciful, how much more should we respond to that mercy with a great sense of thanksgiving, a great sense of service, but also to fulfill the prophecies that have been laid before us. Now, I think a thing that's largely missed is, I'm going to use the expression, the bifurcation of Judaism and Christianity. It seems to be largely missed or forgotten that Christianity is either a continuation of Judaism with a realized Messiah, or it is a new revelation and a new idea and a reconstruction. Now, these are quite difficult concepts, aren't they? However, I think God in his mercy knew that there would be people in his creation that he cared for that would not be Jews. So in his grace and mercy, with his tiny remnants left, and I don't suppose any of us for a moment think there are only 8 people that created the rest of the human race, but we can believe there are 8 people that are progenitors of God's representative race. I think we sit very comfortably with that, can't we? So God needed grace when he makes the covenant.
As a musician, I can tell you that timing is everything. The beat of the drum, the pluck of the strings, the tinkling of the ivories, or the strum of the guitar. If you want the music to sound right, then you have to play in time. And if you're joining with others, everyone needs to play at the right moment. You know, it's the same with what God is doing. Our Creator is playing a melody, and the theme of the song is protecting His children. But like any orchestra, it's important that as we join in, that we too get the timing right. You see, timing is everything. And now is the time to become part of the orchestra that God is assembling. Our God-given purpose is to support and stand with the Jewish people. This is the greatest song you could ever sing and the greatest music you could ever play. Won't you join with the band with Ezra International as we join with what God is doing? Remember, timing is everything, and that time is now.
Institutes, what are known as the Noahide laws, because God was always cared for His creation, all of it. It's interesting when God told Noah to put the provisions like the food, didn't He? All the food, everything the animals needed. It's fairly obvious that they would seed and all that stuff will grow again. I mean, it's not stated with simplicity, isn't it? That all the crops will regrow as well afterwards. So this story really is about judgment and restoration at the end of the day. Anyway, in Judaism, they're assumed to be two separate covenants. This is not dual covenant theology, which is where Jews get saved by one thing and Gentiles get saved by another. So I'm a bit reluctant to say there were dual covenants or even two covenants because I think it's misunderstood. Shall we say there are two different understandings of God's relationship? Maybe that's the better way to put it. So these are actually described in the text. The first biblical covenant is assigned by the rainbow. God will not once again destroy the creation by water. So as we move along to Sinai and later, it's basically the development of God's first command to Noah: "He shall not shed blood unrighteously." So the Jews have got in Jewish understanding, the Jews have got the covenant of Torah based upon the 613 commandments. Now, 613 commandments or mitzvah are actually 613 Bible verses with basically rabbinic interpretations of them. Yeah, rather interesting in one sense that Jews got 613 commandments. Christians have 1,004. If you were looking at it in terms of legalism within the text. However, in Jewish understanding, I think this is implied throughout the scriptures, there is an ethical code for non-Jews or Gentiles. And these are generally known as the 7 Noahide mitzvot, or sometimes the Noahide commandments. So this is when it's a little bit difficult, even though it isn't. Conventionally, only those accepting these covenants can be termed the sons of Noah, and then associated with all the rest of the covenants. So, in this understanding, Gentiles who faithfully keep the Noahide commandments are more valued than Jewish people who don't keep their 613. Isn't that interesting? And it says also in Jewish writings that the righteous Gentiles have a share in the world to come. And if you go to Yad Vashem in Israel, you see the avenue of the righteous Gentiles with the trees with the people's names on. And it's assumed that the people who the trees are named after will have a portion in the world to come. within the Jewish idea of the world to come. And it's as if God made a provision for those who feared him but didn't know him. And this is a direct result of the flood. So based on, let's use a posh word, the post-Diluvian covenant that God makes with Noah's descendants in Genesis 9, 8 through 17, the Babylonian Talmud in Avodah Zachar 64b interpreted the stranger, it's talking about the stranger there, to be all Gentiles who will accept the 7 commandments, constituting the basic laws of morality. Now, to me, I find this one of the most interesting dynamics between Judaism and Christianity. And our beloved workers with Ezra, their work on the field, their greatest skill is to understand who a Jewish person is, to understand what their religious background is, to understand what their liturgical background is, to understand their messianic expectations. And we could go on further than that. Now, when the work of Ezra started, and the work that I was with previously, some few years before, it wasn't really a problem introducing Jewish people to their own God and to the Tanakh, because it had been denied to them. And they were almost, how can I put this? They were pitifully grateful that we actually shared the Hebrew scriptures with them to find their identity. And to say that as Christians, that we love them and care for them, and we saw God's grace and mercy in bringing Jew and Gentile together, that Christians could indeed be part of the Commonwealth of Israel. And they received this. And for the first few years, Christian anti-Semitism, which I've told you about before, was not an issue. However, 5 or 6 years later, the whole situation changed. And the problem was amplified by the idea that particularly Jewish, I want to use the word emissaries rather than missionaries, promulgated the idea that Christians are generally anti-Semitic and also extremely immoral in their behaviours, and therefore got no part in the world to come, and therefore had got no authority or right to speak. However, if they read properly, and if Christians read properly, particularly Acts 15, and research it, we find out what the expectations for non-Jews were following the Deluge. This is before Abraham and Isaac. Yeah? This is part of the very earliest things. God saves mankind, and he has a set of standards for Jewish people, but because he has not forgotten the Gentiles, he has a set of standards for them. These are Noahide laws, or no mitzvah. Okay. And I want you to remember that these 7 apply to Jewish people first, but part of the inclusion of getting together under God's mercy, these 7 apply to everybody, but these 7 apply to Gentiles, whereas the other ones, circumcision comes later, but a lot of the other things that were current at the time don't. So the first injunction is to set up courts that justly enforce the laws of society. Oh dear, we're in a mess there, aren't we? The second was the prohibition of blasphemy. What is blasphemy? Blasphemy is worshipping an other spiritual deity that is not the Lord our God, the King of the universe. Yeah? And idolatry has always been considered one of the biggest sins within the spiritual history of both Christians and Jews. And let's remember, idols aren't always carved out of wood and stone or precious metals. They can be people. If we put individuals, husbands, wives, children, politics, you name it, we put them before God, that is idolatry. So, the provision of blasphemy, yeah? So blasphemy is speaking against our God. Number 3 is prohibition of idolatry in all its ways, shapes and forms, we said. Now the next one, and this is a particularly difficult one in today's society, there are prohibitions of grave sexual immorality. The illicit sexual relationship with one's mother, one's father's wife, another man's wife, his sister from the same mother, and homosexual unions, and bestiality. Up until some years ago, nobody had any problem with that, but today most of these things are considered fairly irrelevant, which might be symptomatic of the problems we've got today. Next, the prohibition of murder. This is interesting. What is murder? In British law, and in Pax Romana, the which I suppose I found on, murder is the taking of human life in secret, which makes a definition between taking life as part of judicial process, and that is very often missed. Yeah, and in the Ten Commandments, it does not say you shall not kill; it says you shall not murder. Little thought for later on. And then the prohibition of eating the limb of a live animal, which actually is a paradigm for cruelty. An aspect of the Noahide laws was expounded by the great scholar Maimonides in his work Law of the Kings, who traced the foundations of these ideas back to Adam and says were established as part of the created order. So Maimonides says 6 items were commanded to Adam, concerning idolatry, blasphemy, bloodshed, illicit sexuality, theft, and various other laws. And in addition to these laws, God added to Noah the law of not eating from the flesh of a live animal. Now, just to close, it's rather interesting if you look at the history of the early church, which is beset by difficulties in the writings of the early church fathers, who, largely speaking, was from a Greek background. Many of them didn't speak Hebrew, and many of them felt that God had finished Jewish people, and so therefore took no interest in anything that had to be said. However, in Acts 15, of the Jerusalem Council, which at the time, Yaakov, or James in English, was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So, Shaul and Barnabas, and I suspect his disciples, went on a very different track, in fact, very different track, to the way the church in Jerusalem were going. And the question was, can Gentiles become followers of Yeshua? So James, in his wisdom, in Acts 15, simply repeats Noahide laws. If you're a Gentile, you want to be considered righteous, you want to be part of our renewed community, Because remember, when Messiah comes, one world, one order's finished, new one begins. If you want to be part of this, all you have to do is follow these Noahide laws that were given essentially at creation, but more importantly, when God decided to bring recompense and recreation after the deluge. So, there you are. God, land people, Gentiles can be part of it, but it's not being part of it just some commandments. It's been part of all of it. So, as ever, God be with you until we meet again.